Welcome back. Welcome back to week 2 of the Shattered Star Quilt Along. So in the part 1 video, we talked about all things pressing. I do encourage you to go and watch that video if you haven't already, because before you can start cutting, you really need to get your fabric nicely pressed. I share lots of tips in that video to help you get a nice, get all those wrinkles and creases out of your fabric. We talk in the blog post, we talk a lot about stabilizers and alternatives to starch. So go and check that out if you need some more tips on all things pressing. But today we're having fun and we're actually diving in and cutting our fabric. Now, when I first started quilting, I actually didn't really know how to properly cut fabric. I kind of cut in haphazardly. I didn't really follow the grain. I didn't follow what was like the width of fabric versus the yardage of the fabric. So these are all things that I'm going to kind of walk you through. But first up, let's talk tools. So you don't need a lot of specialty tools for this step, but there's a few tools that I can't get through any cutting session without. So first up is a rotary cutter. This is a genius tool. There's lots of different models out on the market. Play around, see which ones you like the best, but I do highly recommend getting a rotary cutter. It just has some precision that I find scissors can't beat. So this is a pretty nifty tool. The next tip I'm going to give you is get yourself some replacement blades, because if you're doing a lot of quilting and a lot of cutting, you are going to put a lot of strain on that blade. And just like in your kitchen, if you're working with dull knives, they're actually more dangerous for you than if you maintain and sharpen your knives. So same concept here. The duller your blade, the more pressure it's going to put on your hand and arm when you're cutting. You're going to have to do more cuts on the one cut, so you'll have to repeat cut to get all of the individual fibers, because as the blade gets used and worn down, it starts to skip over some fibers, which is when you have to you'll have to come back and do the same cut over and over again. That's a key indication that you've overused your blade, and you either need to sharpen it or you need to replace it altogether. Rotary cutter, essential. Okay, you'll also need a cutting mat, which you'll see once I show you cutting in action. I do highly recommend you invest in a good self-healing cutting mat. They are not the most inexpensive tool, but I have found that the original one that I got, I wore into very, very quickly, meaning it stopped self-healing very quickly. So, something to keep in mind. I don't know if I'm just an aggressive cutter and I just go for it, and that's why it doesn't heal as efficiently, but I'm finding that generally speaking, every 2 years or so, I'm finding I need to replace my mat, so something to keep in mind. The next essential tools that you will need are some rulers. Now, you don't need every ruler out there. There's a lot of different rulers out on the market. The ones that I can't get through a cutting session without is, first up, this guy. He is 8 inches by 24 inches, and this is a genius ruler for not only cutting yardage, but also when it comes time at the end of the quilt journey when we're squaring up our quilts, this is a handy tool as well. The next one I find very helpful is a 12.5 by 12.5. Just because, you know, after you've done some of your yardage cutting, once you come down to subcut, I find that this is a little bit easier to manage. You can go, sometimes when I'm doing smaller cuts, I will come down in size to a 6 by 12 inch. So these 3 rulers really do get me through most of my cutting and piecing sessions. It took me a while before I picked one of these up, and I really, really, really highly recommend it. It makes cutting yardage super easy, and you'll see it in action. Okay, so those are the tools you need. That pretty much sums it up. Those are all the only tools that I use. Let's see it in action. So I thought I would start us off with yardage, because I think dealing with larger pieces of fabric can be more challenging to know how to cut. So you'll see here I've got my cutting mat. This is an Alvin one. I got it, I think a year and a half or 2 years ago. It's about 36 by 24, I believe, which is really nice because I can get a full yard of fabric on it, and I can get a full half width of fabric that way. What I've done though is I've actually folded it because I think most of us have, at least I started off with a much smaller cutting mat. So just in case you have a smaller cutting surface to work with, I wanted to show you how you could tackle it at home. So this is about a yard, a little less than a yard of fabric, and what I've done, so this is the original fold that comes with fabric that's cut off the bolt. So I've left that intact, and then you have your salvages at the top. So both salvages together, and then the fold down here. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to fold this again in half. So I've got 4 layers of fabric together. Stacked up, and what I'm going to do is I just very gently place them so that this line is even with the salvages at the top. And then what I do is for this bottom line, I align that on my mat so that I try and get this bottom folded line as parallel with one of the lines on my mat as possible. So I'm folding so that this is nice and straight with one line on my mat, and then this is folded to meet up with the salvages. That's my starting point. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my larger ruler, so this is the 8.5 by 24. And what I do is I start by getting a straight edge. So whenever you're cutting fabric, you really want to keep things as even as possible. In order to do that, you want to start with a nice straight edge. To get that straight edge, what you need to do, or at least how I do it, I'm just going to push that down a little. So I always start by, let me back up for a second. One of the things that quilters often caution is using the lines on your cutting mat as your guiding lines. The reason why they say to be cautious about that is because as you use your cutting mat, those lines can get warped over time, which is why they often recommend to just use the lines on your ruler. Great tip, but what I do is I like to initially use a combination of the lines on my ruler plus some of the lines on my mat to help me get that initial straight line or the straight cut. So what I do is, because this is very much an uneven line, I come in and I line my ruler up on, I line it up on the lines on my mat, also looking to make sure that I'm lining up the lines parallel. So I'm looking for a straight line this way, and I'm looking to line my ruler up on my mat with straight lines this way, which is why we spend some time to get this bottom straight line so that I know my fabric is at least sit squarely within those lines. All I'm going to do is, so I try and I want to make sure that I'm getting through all 4 layers of fabric here, because I want to make sure that I'm getting a nice straight cut through all of those 4 layers so that once we come and start cutting, I've got everything nice and straight. So all I want to do again is line up. I'm lining up a line on my ruler along a line on my mat. I'm making sure that my lines running this way are nice and even. And then I'm just going to take my first cut. Easy as that. And there you are. So what I like to do with this one is I just like to open it up to make sure that I have a full run. I've caught all 4 layers. Sometimes the edge will be very skewed depending on how well it was cut at the quilt store. Or if you've decided to pre-wash, things might have gotten a little bit wonky. So you really want to have that nice sharp edge to start off with. And then from there, it becomes an easy step of just knowing taking your cuts. So when I'm cutting my width of fabric strips, which is what I recommend, whenever you're working with cutting your fabrics for a quilt, what you're looking to do is always to start with width of fabric cuts. So width of fabric, shortened to WOF, means the width of fabric is the what's from selvage to selvage. From selvage to selvage, that's the width of fabric. And in this case, I'm dealing with about a 44-inch width of fabric. So what I'm doing is right now, I'm just taking that, I'm lining up the one line on my ruler along that sharp edge that I've created. And then I'm also looking to make sure that that bottom line is also lined up nicely on my ruler. So I'm lining up this line and I'm lining up this line, making sure that I have the width that I need for the fabric pieces that I'm going to be cutting. And then we just make the cut. Now what you can do, and what I highly recommend, is at this point you want to move your fabric the least amount as possible. So what I do is I simply lift my ruler. I like to pull this one aside just so that I can clearly see where my new line is, and then I will just come and line up the lines again, line up this bottom line, and then take another cut. And then I would continue based off of how many strips I needed to cut. Once I've cut my strips, what I can then do is come back here. The next step is to cut down your strips, so I'll show you that now. Okay, once you have your strips cut, what you want to do now, at this point, you can opt to switch down to the smaller ruler. So this is when I normally switch down to the 12.5 by 12.5, just because I find it a little bit easier to maneuver. This is just a personal preference. You do what feels right to you, or based off of the tools that you have at your availability. So what I'm doing now is I need to get rid of the selvages. And so what I'm doing is I'm lining up my ruler, the line on my ruler along this edge. And then I'm also making sure I've got a nice straight edge down here. This will ensure that once I make this cut, it's nice and square. And then we just cut. Voila. Okay, once you have your strip cut, then you can subcut it down. Now you're going to notice that I'm flipping this. The reason I'm flipping it is because I'm right-handed, so I like to have my ruler on the left and then I cut with my right hand. If you're left-handed, you would be doing this opposite, which I can't demo because I'm pretty useless with my left hand. But a lot of people will cut towards themselves. I don't feel comfortable doing that. I know that it's generally viewed as a no-no. It's a dangerous way to cut. I know that some quilters prefer to do that so that they move their fabric the least amount as possible. I find that cutting towards myself this way, I don't have the same control or leverage, and I find that oftentimes, the times that I have done it, my cuts are off. So I can't get as a nice straight cut. If you're comfortable doing that, then by all means. I am not, though. I have not found myself to have great success that way. Plus, just a little side note, these guys are really sharp. You'll notice that every time I make a cut, I retract my blade. So the reason why I do that, and I'm pretty consistent about doing that, is because I've dropped this on my hand before and caused some good damage. So these suckers are sharp. There are gloves, protective gloves that you can get so that when you're cutting, should you make a mistake, there's some metal mesh gloves that you can get so that you don't cut yourself. I haven't picked up a pair yet myself, but they definitely are definitely but more on the safe side. They definitely increase your safety. So just a little note there that there are some different tools to help increase the safety with these sharp tools we're working with. So what I've done is, again, I've just lined up this strip that I've cut and lined it up along the straight line on my mat. That's just my preference. At this point, it's really not critical because I'm really relying at this point on the lines on my ruler. So what we've done is we've cut our width of fabric strips. Now I'm coming in and I'm subcutting that. And how I'm subcutting that is, again, I'm lining up the lines on my ruler with the bottom line of my fabric strip. This line is also lined up, and this line is also lined up. So before I make any cut, I'm making sure that I have a nice alignment along all 3 lines of my fabric with my ruler. This means that I am getting a nice square cut every time that I make a cut. You'll also note that this is still folded, right? So I'm making 2 cuts at once. So I'll show you that. So I'm gonna make my cut, and then if I pull this aside, you'll see that I have 2 pieces of fabric. Now, a comment on folding your fabric and cutting. The more layers you have, so the more folds in your fabric you have, the more that where you have your fold, things can get askew. So I tend to not fold more than 4 times, meaning having 4 layers of fabric at a time. I find anything beyond that, you start to lose accuracy, and you get, especially on this bit, you'll get a lot more wonky. It will kind of dip in and then come back out. It's one of the things that, like I said, you fold it and it does create a little bit of an indentation. Which is why some quilters actually avoid anything using this bit within their blocks. That's entirely up to you. I still use it. I'll press it out and I'll just make it work. Okay, so that is cutting strips with the fabric. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to cut a fat quarter. Okay, so I have a fat quarter here on my cutting mat, and it's already nicely pressed. And what I'm going to do, again, just because you may not have a large cutting surface, I'm going to fold it in half so you can see a fat quarter in action. So similar to the yardage that I cut earlier, all I want to do is fold this piece of fabric in half. Now what I'm doing, oftentimes I find fat quarters are a little bit more wonky, so I tend to use the selvage as my guide to get kind of a straight edge, as a guiding to just kind of line up my fabric here. So I'm using this as my guide at the top. Once I have it folded in half, I'm going to come down and I'm going to line up this bottom folded edge. So what I do is I'm not pulling on it, and I'm not like giving it a hard press. I'm just kind of laying it out so that I make sure that when it is laid flat, this bottom line is still nice and straight with that line on my mat. Here I'm going in with the 12.5 inch by 12.5 inch. You can go back to the 8.5 by 24 inch. It's entirely up to you. But what you want to do is, again, come over here at the edge, and you want to cut off this edge on the left to give yourself a nice starting straight edge. So just make that cut. Now again, I was lining up not only this line with my ruler, but I was also making sure the parallel lines were also even. So again, I'm just going to double check that I got a full strip of cutting here, that I haven't missed anything, that there wasn't a piece that was even more wonky on the inside, which does happen. So then once I have my nice straight edge, I'm going to come and I'm going to make this first cut. So just a note, if you're working on the fat quarter friendly version, then what you want to do here is you're going to come and cut off your selvage. So again, I'm lining up this line and I'm lining up this line. I'm going to cut those off. And then for here, because depending on the number of pieces, what you want to do is you then can open it up and subcut based off of what the number of pieces that you need. So one of the tips that I wanted to share is to kind of look at the fabric requirements that you have for your quilt that you're working on, and try and think through how many pieces you need to cut from each strip, so that you maximize your cutting session. So for instance, if you had multiples of these, then you would just try and through that one strip, cut as many of them as possible and then move on to the next size. The next thing I also kind of want to mention is whenever you're setting yourself up for a cutting session is to also always start with the largest cuts and then work down to your smallest ones. This normally helps maximize your fabric usage. And also if you cut a strip where you needed a larger strip for one piece, but then you need some smaller pieces out of that same strip, then you can come back to this piece and cut it down. So cut it down to the size that you'll need for your next pieces and continue on. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a straight line on this big piece of fabric and then just making sure that I'm cutting the right width, and then I'm just going to cut this strip off. And this allows me to then continue subcutting from this piece without having to cut a whole new strip. I hope that makes sense. But you'll notice, especially if you're working with the Shattered Star quilt, then you'll notice that this becomes an efficient use of your fabric. So you cut the larger A pieces, and then you can move on to your smaller C, D, and E pieces from the second trimming that you've done. And that's all there is to it, guys. That's as complex as quilt cutting gets. So I hope that was helpful in terms of how to cut your fabric. I showed you both how to cut yardage and how to cut a fat quarter. Really the key is to remember to try and keep a nice straight edge on that end of your fabric. So making sure that you've got a nice straight edge so that you can make nice square cuts. This will really set you up for success when it comes to piecing your quilt together. The cutting and pressing stage is really important. These are building blocks in the quilt journey. So the more accurate you are at this stage, the easier it will come when you're making your quilt blocks. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave them in the comment box down below or send me an email. I'm always happy to help you guys out. Have a good one.